about the Polish case, which I've been studying since 2012. And at the beginning, me and my colleagues tend to think about it as a kind of Polish aberration. You know, in Poland we have strong Catholic Church, we have strong nationalist trends, we have a certain strong tradition of gender nationalism. So we kind of expect these things to happen. But of course, it soon became clear that this is, first of all, not only Polish but global phenomenon. That of course there are regional and national differences, but there are also connections between different contexts. And gradually over this last 10 years, we could see a sort of saturation of the public debates and political narratives by this gender or anti-gender, actually, narratives and discourses. And this is something that really caught my attention, that, you know, it is quite easy to just dismiss this process, thinking that people like Kaczynski or Bolsonaro or Trump are gender traditionalists. And of course, to some extent they are. But the thing is that just as Kaczynski was not so eager to introduce an abortion ban in 2005 when he came to power, the first round when Law and Justice was in power. And also Salvini was not always this, you know, kiss-crossing defender of traditional family. So something has happened during the last decade, and I think that we need to capture this process in the making. So when it comes to populism, I basically refer to this ideational definition, which is proposed by Kasmude, Kaltwasser, Ruth Wodak, and others, which defines populism as a thin ideology. So the main tenets of this ideological frame or position is that it divides people into two antagonistic camps, the pure people and the corrupt, immoral, cunning elites, that it fetishizes the will of the people, and that because it is a thin ideology, it often becomes intertwined with other ideologies, more robust ideological projects, if you will. And also what's really important is that it's a form of affective politics. It doesn't, of course, mean that politics in general is void of affects or emotions, but rather that as Ruth Wodak has put it quite famously, we can conceptualize right-wing populism as politics of fear. Although I think that it is also important to think of other emotions such as shame, pride, sense of solidarity and community, or a sense of belonging. So it is also quite important to think of populism as not only opposing structure of power, but also opposing what populists define as elite culture. And in that sense, I'm very much indebted to Margaret Canavan, who said that populism in modern democratic societies is best seen as an appeal to the people against both the established structure of power and the dominant ideas and values of the society. And in the case of right-wing populists, it is usually the liberal democracy that is seen as either in need of saving or in need of changing. And in the Polish case, what we could observe during the last couple of years, and this is the idea which has been developed by Marta Kotwas and Jan Kubik, we could see the gradual symbolic thickening of public culture, which refers to the question, well, if populism is a thin ideology, how does it thicken, right? So they point to the fact that even prior to the Law and Justice ascent to power, we could observe this gradual symbolic thickening of public culture through the intensification of Catholic and nationalist discourses, and this resulted in the expansion of the discursive opportunity structure for right-wing actors. And then, of course, once these right-wing actors came to power, they managed to strengthen those tendencies even more, even farther. So then, of course, the main question for us, I guess, is well, if we observe those tendencies, how can we conceptualize them? So there has been quite a few scholars, although I must say that it is quite surprising that there is so little attention to gender, or maybe I shouldn't be surprised anymore, in the mainstream scholarship on populism, including right-wing populism. So when we look at this more mainstream approaches, we have, for example, Mood and Kaltwasser analysis of 4 different populist regimes, both right-wing and left-wing, where they conclude that basically conceptually populism has no specific relationship to gender, and gender differences are considered secondary, if not irrelevant, to populist politics. And this is a view that I deeply disagree with, and it's quite interesting to think about why did they come to this conclusion. Is it a question of methods, or is it a question of a specific time period within which they observed or analyzed those populist parties? Other approaches, such as Ruth Wodak's, look at right-wing populism, drawing ideologically from other ideological projects, such as gendered nationalism. But of course, the strength of gendered nationalism in different contexts varies. So the question is, to what extent we can use this conceptualization for our specific contexts. And of course, there are analysis which shows that gender matters for the supply side. So charismatic leaders tend to be male, or they perform specific type of strongman masculinity, Bolsonaro and Trump being probably the most characteristic cases, or the best cases to illustrate this. But then, of course, we need to look at female leaders who often do not really perform this type of strength or domination that male leaders do. And Beata Szydło, Polish MP, representing the Law and Justice government, is probably the best illustration of this tendency, because she projected this very maternal, protective, caring type of leadership. And then, of course, there are studies which show that gender matters for the demand side. So gender gap in voting for right-wing populist parties is something that quite few scholars focused on. But first of all, these studies focused mostly on radical right-wing parties or extreme right-wing parties, and not necessarily this mainstream right-wing populists, such as Law and Justice, for example, who actually had 51% of women among their voters. And there are also studies which show that this gap might be closing. And Gabriel Dietze, for example, shows how in Germany, for example, AfD has been quite skillful in drawing support from women through promoting specific types of women-focused messages, such as, for example, focusing on new maternalism or on sexual exceptionalism, in a way promoting right-wing agenda as a way to protect young women's sexual freedom from, of course, the outsiders, the barbarians. So in our work, because I will come to that, the analysis that I'm presenting today is draws from the book with Agnieszka Graff. We are more, I would say, inspired by, of course, feminist scholars who looked at the ways in which right-wing populism is gendered. And of course, one element of this analysis or of those conceptualizations look at the ways in which both opposition to gender and populism is fueled by neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism understood both as economic transformation, but also, well, in a sense, democratic crisis caused by the process of neoliberalization. And also, Dietze and Roth, in their book from last year, show how populists use gender as a way to sanitize extreme right-wing discourse to make their messages concerning racism or Islamophobia more palatable to mainstream audiences. And to some extent, this seems to be very important strategic ways in which right-wing populist discourses become gendered. And Julie Roth actually discusses the patterns of engendering in right-wing populist discourses, including the ways in which scandals and ethnic others become gendered, and this sort of scandal in Cologne being one of the probably most most widely discussed cases. Feminationalism is of course included here, as well as white remasculinization, or posing gender as an ideological colonization from the West or from the elites. And finally, the gendering of social inequalities in this ethno-sexist fashion. And finally, this is really interesting to us, and we were really sad that the book by Dietze and Roth has been published last year when our book was already finished, because we thought that this is really something that we could engage in a conversation with, and hopefully we will be able to do that today. Birgit Sauer's idea that the right-wing populism is a project of masculinist identity politics. On the one hand, these are affects, anger, or exclusive solidarity, and something which I found very enlightening, the idea of being able to not care for others anymore, this freedom to not caring. And on the other hand, the opposition to commodification of everyday lives at the expense of gender equality. And as I've mentioned, this analysis or this proposition that I am talking about today is the outcome of a book project together with Agnieszka Graff, Antigender Politics in the Populist Moment, which hopefully will be out in a couple of months. What we decided to do here is to look at the ways in which anti-gender discourse is used or seeps into right-wing populist discourses and politics, but also look at the organizational side of the collaboration between those different actors at different levels. And probably I should say a few words about the ways in which we see anti-gender movement, because I guess probably all of us know that there is this new wave of opposition to gender theory, to sexual reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, sex education, reproductive technologies, divorce, and so on. But there are, of course, different views on whether it is something that is a continuation of a backlash, or is it something new. And I'm quite convinced that it is something new. Of course, some of the discourses and some of the collaborations and actors who engage in them are rooted in culture wars of the 80s and 90s. And reflect this broader cultural conflict over modernity. So if we look, for example, at the initiatives called Save Our Children, immediately we can link it to Anita Bryant's campaign, which was actually called Save Our Children as well, or to Phyllis Schlafly opposition to ERA in the United States. But at the same time, what makes this new wave unique is its connection to right-wing populism. So in our view, we should see anti-gender movement as a conservative or actually reactionary opposition to neoliberalism as a social-cultural formation. And by that we mean that it is structured anti-gender mobilization or anti-gender campaigns when we look at the discourse that they are promoting, they are actually positioning themselves as those who want to protect people from the alienation that is brought about by neoliberalism as a cultural norm of responsibilization, of entrepreneurialism, of individualism, and so on. And in that sense, they are linking feminism and LGBT and fight for LGBTQ rights with global colonialism on the one hand, and with economic colonialism on the other hand. And finally, this new trend or this new movement reflects a new global moral geography of Europe. So today, countries such as Poland or Hungary or Russia present themselves as those who can save the West from its own moral degeneration. So finally, the East becomes the savior of the West, not the region that needs to catch up with the West. And of course, the idea is here that in the East was able to retain its healthy Christian core, which is the basis of Western Christian civilization, and sort of now we can give back your true values and true ideas to you in the West. So on the other hand, it's also interesting to see the anti-gender movement as part of global illiberal civil society. So many of the organizations that we talk about, such as, for example, World Congress of Families or Tradition, Family and Property, which originated in Brazil in the 60s, those organizations have been there for quite a long time. But now they formed new alliances and new types of cooperation, both within civil society and also with religious fundamentalist groups and with political actors. So if we look at the anti-gender movement, on the one hand, we have the usual suspects, right? The Vatican and Protestant groups, evangelicals, Orthodox, and so on. But on the other hand, we have secular national organizations which often have ties with religious fundamentalist actors, but which present themselves either as a mass mobilization from the grassroots, or organizations which sort of represent civil society aiming to defend true democracy and aiming to defend the true liberal values in a way that have been proposed by ultraconservative groups. And of course, there is a lot of transnational organization and transnational networks. And the World Congress of Families, the last one which took place in Verona in 2019, is a case in point, where you had representatives of grassroots groups, transnational civil society organizations, religious actors, politicians, aristocracy, business, and so on. So in that sense, it is a part of an effort to form a new global order, but also new global elite. And when we look at Poland, there are actually three phases of anti-gender campaigns, which reflect both the breadth of the anti-gender agenda, but also the flexibility of those actors. So the first phase started around 2012. At the beginning, it was focused on preventing the ratification of Istanbul Convention by promoting the idea that there is something called gender ideology, and this is dangerous to children, to the family, to sexual integrity of people, and of course, sex education was one of important battles, similarly to Germany, right, where the changes in sex education curriculum has been part of, or an element of, a popular mobilization. And the next stage took place in 2015, just before the elections, parliamentary elections, and that was the moment of so-called the refugee crisis, when the genderists became integrated with refugees. So the idea was promoted there, and you can see here the front cover of a right-wing weekly w sieci. So the idea was that, of course, now we enter into a crucial phase of culture wars, and the caption says, "Islamic rape on Europe, our report on what Brussels elites want to hide from the people." So the idea is, of course, that first of all, there is a danger to women's sexual freedom, but to their bodies as well, to our white women. But at the same time, that bringing in refugees is a plot from the outside, is a plot from the Brussels, and feminists and genderists are pro-refugee because they want to disintegrate Polish nation, Polish family, and Polish Catholic traditions. And immediately after parliamentary elections, right-wing groups or ultra-conservative groups such as Ordo Juris Institute, one of the key organizations promoting anti-gender campaigns in Poland, started to campaign for a total abortion ban. In Poland, we have already a ban on abortion since 1993, but the idea was that there are three exceptions, such as malformation of the fetus, danger to women's health or life, and rape or incest. And the idea was to get rid of those exceptions in order to bring about a true Catholic and true moral rejuvenation of the nation. And because of the mass demonstrations of Polish women in 2016, this project has been buried in the commissions. But of course, it was not the last one that was proposed, because in 2020, we had another attempt, this time successful, to make the Polish law even more restrictive. In October 2020, Constitutional Tribunal issued a ruling saying that abortion should not be legal in case of serious malformation of the fetus. And that also was met with huge demonstrations, but these were largely ineffective, because that type of decision is not easy to get back. And then that's around 2018-19 also, more focus went towards so-called LGBT ideology. So women and feminists were largely, and then refugees, were displaced by the evil gay men mostly, or trans people, who allegedly want to convert our children, our Polish children, to homosexuality. And that has become one of the main fields in which the anti-gender movement works with. And the map with those red elements shows the number of Polish municipalities and voivodeships where the local municipalities signed so-called family charters declarations or LGBT free zone declarations. And that was also one of the initiatives promoted by Ordo Iuris Institute. So as you can see, the idea of who is the enemy is very flexible. This broad term genderists include both feminists or broadly women who want to have, for example, reproductive rights secured by the state, but also LGBTQ community, trans people, but also refugees and all the others in the Polish society. And in that sense, this struggle does not focus on one political issue or one legislative initiative, but it sort of moves quite smoothly from one to another, which of course broadens the possibility to create collaborations and cooperations or alliances around them. When we think about the relationship between the anti-gender movement and the right-wing populists, we propose the notion of opportunistic synergy, which is a dynamic that is both ideological discursive and strategic organizational. So on the one hand, it allows populism to gain this ideological coherence or thicken ideologically, which is always the problem if we think about right-wing or populism in general as a thin ideology. The question is always what type of other ideologies are brought in to make this a more robust ideological project. And of course, this mostly refers to the question of who are the elites and who are the people. So within this border-making process, the people are, of course, local, gender conservative, innocent, oppressed and colonized, and elites are global or globally connected, cosmopolitan, immoral, of course, and cunning, trying to gain more power and more influence. And of course, this allows to bring the question of affect here. And if we look at those pictures from the campaigns promoted by anti-gender organizations, they often promote this idea of being a hero for the children, right? Who are sexualized, who are abused by gay men or feminists, who are always wide, blue-eyed angels in need of saving. And of course, this issue of in danger is something that is very often a trope that very often appears in conspiracy theories or moral panics. But in this specific case, it really helps to strengthen this vision, this Manichaean vision of a political divide. So we fight against people not only because they have more power than us, but because they are basically evil. They are the devil. So if we look at the films, for example, from the protests against Judith Butler's visit in São Paulo, you can see a lot of banners with, sayings such as take your ideologies back to hell, or 666. So the idea is that there is a deep moral divide or divide between evil and good and goodness that plays out here. And another important element is that this focus on traditional family very much connects with welfare chauvinist pro-family policies that right-wing populist parties promote, propose, or implement. And in the case of Poland and Hungary, we can see how this sort of exclusionary type of chauvinist welfare changes or policies are or help to gain wide public support for those ideas. So on the one hand, it is strategic in a ways in which makes certain extreme ideas more palatable, but on the other hand, it is very much connected to the ways in which right-wing populists in some countries are able to present themselves as those who oppose cuts in family policies or in social policies, right? As those who rejuvenate or promise to rejuvenate the welfare state. And at the same time, this is a process which fosters elite change on many levels. If you think about political elites, this is quite obvious, but then of course it connects to intellectual elites, elites in academia, judicial elites, and so on and so forth, the media. So in that sense, the people from those ultra-conservative organizations become the new cadres of right-wing populists, which is very visible in Poland today, where we can see how people from the Juris Institute, for example, enter crucial consultation bodies at the EU level or become recruited for the judicial posts and so on. So they gain legitimacy and voice in public sphere, and of course access to resources and political power, but also a certain level of secular credibility. So, which of course begs the question to what extent populism is really anti-elitist, and to what extent it focuses on opposing pluralism within the elites. And my final notion concerns what has enabled this type of energy or synergy, actually. On the one hand, this is connected to gradual secularization of anti-gender. This is something that that we can observe in anti-choice groups for the last 10 years or so, that it's a gradual takeover of concepts such as human rights or minority rights. In the Polish case, for example, the total ban on abortion was justified as a way to protect minorities, meaning children with disabilities, which is a term used to discuss the situation where the fetus is diagnosed with serious malformation. Secondly, the ultra-conservative critiques of gender are basically framed in populist terms today. So it is not the obedience to God that is the order of the day, but rather rebellion against godless elites. Another issue is the ways in which opposition to gender is presented as opposition to neoliberal sociocultural formation. So family in this discourse is presented as, of course, traditional family, is presented as the refuge from alienating powers of the market and the false promise of emancipation. And of course, if you think about the critiques of neoliberal feminism, which were expressed by scholars such as Nancy Fraser or Wendy Brown and others, you can see an eerie coherence between some elements of the anti-gender discourse and some critiques of neoliberal feminism promoted or proposed by feminist scholars, right, on the left. So there is, of course, the question, how to navigate this field within which this convergence exists. And finally, we can see this remarkable flexibility of the anti-colonial frame, East versus West, but also North versus South, sort of global South, because, and that connects, of course, to affects, because if you read anti-gender pundits such as Gabrielle Kubi, she's very clear and very, she stresses often the ways in which liberal elites should feel ashamed of the fact that they colonized, of course there's always the they, not we, that they colonized people in Africa, for example, or Asia. And at the same time, in other contexts, such as Poland, this, I would say, racist overtone or anti-Semitic overtone becomes much more visible or much more pronounced. So depending on the context, it can be structured, this anti-colonial frame, as critiquing the actual colonial history of certain countries, but at the same time it can be used without any connection with the actual history of colonization. So this is all from me. Thank you so much, and I hope now there will be some space for discussion.
Elżbieta, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking